Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.
Welcome to this special Independence Day edition of Blue Republican Radio. With me, the original Blue Republican, Robin Koerner. I wasn't feeling too good this week, and I thought I might skip this show and just run a pre-recorded show in its place, one of my earlier interviews. But I thought, Independence Day, that's kind of important, isn't it? I should step up. And I also thought how cool it would be to have the Declaration of Independence read in the accent of a native of the land from which we as Americans won our independence. And I thought perhaps we should consider that Declaration of Independence and then consider a compare and contrast between we who won the independence from Britain from a supposedly tyrannical monarch and how the British are doing with their supposedly tyrannical monarchy. I think the compare and contrast might be quite instructive as to our present state of liberties. So let us start here with our American Declaration of Independence. Action of the Second Continental Congress on July the 4th, 1776. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them, and formidable only to tyrants. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of the superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offences, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighbouring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burned our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy, scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy of the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavoured to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation, and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honour. That's quite something, isn't it? That's worth a bit of a meditation. That's worth 8 or 9 minutes at the top of a show that purports to care about liberty. I want to put it in your heads, because I want us to think about it and talk about it a little bit for the rest of the show. And something I'm going to read to you later will make direct reference to that document. By the way, the Declaration of Independence, I don't know how much you know about it and how much you picked up on it, makes reference to the ancient charters and these fundamental liberties that were begun to be enshrined in the Magna Carta. And on this show, a few weeks ago, we celebrated the 800th anniversary of that Magna Carta as of June the 15th this year. So yes, so the founders knew, the founders understood the tradition that they were preserving for themselves by formally breaking away from, in a sense. Do we still have that spirit in us in America? We better find it. We better find it, or what these founders did on July the 4th, 1776, well, we'll be wasting it. We'll be profoundly wasting it. We're going into the break. Thanks for being with me. Happy Independence Day. We'll be back soon. And, you know, if it is the case, well, as it is the case, that America was founded by breaking away from Britain, then to a first approximation, American political history before the 18th century or so is British political history. As most American school children know, in the 17th century, John Locke crystallized the idea that human law should reflect natural law. But the idea that law must serve the well-being of the people on whom it is imposed goes back at least to the Anglo-Saxons. Since tyranny must shape to itself both the law and the political institutions of its day, it stands to reason that when a governing elite has gone too far in abusing its power, the fight back for liberty by the people at large does not start directly in the political realm or in legislation itself. Throughout history, in fact, changing a country's politics and statutes has been the final goal of forceful popular attempts to contain power. But mass refusal to accept political abuses has always begun in the culture. Culture is a vague term, so let's define it as the sum of actions of the citizens of a country, the attitudes that drive their responses to events, their expectations of what they may do, and the memories of what they and perhaps their ancestors have always done. The founding of the United States is just one example of this process. In 1776, American independence, as in 1689, the original Bill of Rights, that's the English Bill of Rights, 1628, the Petition of Right, 1215, Magna Carta, which I have been celebrating on this show and in my articles, and even 1014, the Anglo-Saxon Charter. Freedoms that citizens already believed they had were codified and concretized to shape political institutions. And in each case, this shaping of political entities with the purpose of increasing or protecting the rights of free individuals that were already recognized in the culture has been invariably triggered by the overreach of the country's governing elite, or at least part of it. And of course, that is how America was founded. Seen in this light, the American Revolution was not so much an American revolution as a British evolution, another turn in the ratchet of Anglo political liberty, driven by the kind of cultural conservatism that all liberals should celebrate. As William Pitt the Elder, statesman and former British Prime Minister, said as he spoke against the Stamp Act in the year of the American founding, quote, "I rejoice that America has resisted. 3 million people so dead to all feelings of liberty as voluntarily to submit to be slaves would have been fit instruments to make slaves of the rest of us." Unquote. This reflects the interesting fact that the attitudes that drove American independence were found not only among the colonists, they were as prevalent among their British compatriots in the motherland, born from and into the same Anglo culture. Pitt's use of the word feelings is telling. Feelings are not defined in law or carved over the doors of our most important state buildings. Rather, as Pitt was acknowledging, they are the sentiments that drive political change, reflective of the prevalent attitudes and expectations in society. In fact, in the Anglo tradition, the political elite has explicitly recognized that the feelings and expectations of the people are the ultimate limits on its power, and has conceded as much when it has had to negotiate with the people that it governs. The Magna Carta, various coronation declarations going back even as far as a millennium, the Petition of Right, etc., all of which I mentioned, all refer explicitly to the customs of the people, which are those freedoms that the people have a right to expect simply because they are commonly asserted and have been enjoyed for so long. These today we would call natural rights. These customs exist in the minds of the people, defining, albeit fluidly, the boundaries in which earlier kings and now politicians must confine themselves if they are not to risk a popular backlash that makes governing impossible. The modern liberty movement must take heed of this lesson of history. Large-scale popular movements against power are triggered not when enough people see in an abstract right has been taken from them, but when enough people actually experience their everyday lives as being impinged upon. Put another way, it's when power offends our cultural freedoms, not our political liberty, that we rise up against it. Why else have both the left and the right in our time sat relatively silent as our rights to due process, privacy and free speech have been removed by such legislation as the Patriot Act and the NDAA, and yet become very vociferous over our right to smoke weed on the left, say, or own guns without restriction on the right, for example? The answer, at least in part, is that smoking weed and or using guns are part of the culture for many Americans. So government overreach into those areas actually feels like a personal infringement. In contrast, removing your right to due process doesn't feel like anything at all until you actually need to use due process. And invading your privacy doesn't feel like anything at all for sure if you don't even know that it's happening. Independence Day makes many of us feel patriotic. That term, patriotism, originally meant loyalty not to a cause of separation from Britain, but to the very ideas of liberty worked up through an Anglo tradition of many hundreds of years, distilled marvelously in our Constitution. These ideas, filling coffee shop conversations everywhere at the time, even in the 18th century, constituted a kind of cultural norm and was shared by Britons on both sides of the Atlantic, as I said. True patriots today are committed to the same ideas. That subset who can fairly claim the spirit of American independence are the few who will put their own well-being at risk to defend them. One of those people putting their well-being at risk to defend those ideas, I would like to suggest, is Edward Snowden. His revelations have altered American political discourse by changing the everyday American experience of sending an email or making a phone call from one of privately communicating with a loved one, for example, to one of sharing one's life with the state. Mr. Snowden's importance is less that he has told us anything new about the massively invasive power that government has assumed for itself since at least 2001. There are myriad accessible articles, for example, about the Patriot Act, NDAA, etc., and their implementation that anyone could have read any time in the last decade. No, what Snowden has done, in fact, is something much more important. He has turned our government's violation of our political liberties, which most of us know only as words on a document, into a felt, experienced violation of our cultural liberties, of our cultural norms, of which we can feel as we go about our daily lives. And when enough people feel that way, drawing on their customs, attitudes and expectations of liberty, not just on their political institutions, they push back, forcing legislative and political lines to get redrawn in a manner that reclaims the liberties that have been lost. As per the list of dates that I've already given you, it has happened throughout history, and it happened in 1776, a happening that we are celebrating today. The founders were not ideological revolutionaries. They were, every step of the way, acting in the Anglo tradition of liberty, a tradition that the British elite in that time was failing itself to respect, as our American elite fails to respect it now. The Founders' Revolution was therefore a culturally rooted resistance to a violation of the customs of that very same culture, but its outcomes were, as intended and as always, profoundly political. Until now, our government, or as they style themselves, our governors, have managed to take away so many of our political freedoms without too many people feeling a thing. Snowden's revelations are important inasmuch as they have helped turn the overbearing reach of power from a legal and political abstraction to a felt reality in our daily lives, as I've already said. On Independence Day, it is appropriate to let ourselves be inspired by the simple fact that Edward Snowden, for example, is an American. Snowden as much comes out of a culture of American independence as he contributes to it. Don't think that the Chinese, Russians, Iranians and French governments, for example, aren't doing all the things that the Americans are, or that at least they would if they had American resources and power. But Edward Snowden isn't Chinese or Russian or Iranian or French. Perhaps that's no accident. Perhaps it's worth celebrating the fact that there is still enough of the founding independent spirit of these United States left that caused one of its sons, Edward Snowden, not just to hold to its founding values, but to actually do something about them at risk to himself. The American liberty movement is understandably preoccupied with law, policy, and political institutions, and all of these are, of course, profoundly important. But the real game is in people's minds. If we can strengthen our culture of freedom by telling the truth about where we stand today, and thereby stimulating that healthy sense of how dare they, then the politics shall take care of themselves. Repealing a bill is hard for you and me to do. Getting people to care is less hard. Snowden has gotten many people to care. As Bill Clinton said, there is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. This is Blue Republican Radio.
Trust. For nearly 4 decades, that is the reputation Roberts & Roberts Brokerage has forged with their customers. Now, with their full e-commerce website, rrbi.co, it's easier than ever to buy or sell precious metals via Bitcoin or major credit card. Visit them online at rrbi.co or call 800-874-9760 to speak with an experienced professional today. Roberts & Roberts, when you're serious about precious metals.
Affordable health insurance was the promise of Obamacare. But for many, the government mandate caused more problems than it solved. This is Dr. Elena George from Medicine on Call, and I want to tell you about a truly affordable alternative allowed under Obamacare, Liberty HealthShare. Liberty HealthShare bypasses doctor and hospital panels, giving you the freedom to choose. And with a maximum of $500 out of pocket per person and 100% coverage up to $1 million per year per occurrence, you can rest assured knowing you and your family are protected. Coverage starts as low as $107 per month and also includes dental, vision, pharmacy, and holistic care. Liberty HealthShare puts you back in charge of your health. Visit them online at libertyoncall.org. Again, for a true affordable alternative to Obamacare, visit libertyoncall.org or call toll-free 1-800-714-6993 today.
As I've mentioned, 1776 and the foundation of our nation was an assertion by the people of rights they already believed they had. They didn't create anything new. They were referencing customs and rights that had been laid down before in various documents and by various authors such as Locke, etc. So the important thing about the Declaration wasn't actually that it was a declaration, it was that it was a declaration that went along with action. It was a set of demands that people were prepared to pay a price to have. And, you know, in the spirit of that, I think we need to be acting today because we obviously are facing a similar issue to what was faced in 1776 with a state run amok and trampling over the rights of we the people. And if you're listening to this show, you probably believe that as much as I do. And if you don't, what I want to read to you now, I hope will make you consider that perhaps I am right about that. In the spirit of the Declaration of Independence and indeed the Constitution, and in celebration of the 800th anniversary of the Magna Carta, which I mentioned earlier in the show, with the help of a constitutional attorney and friend of mine, Chris Ann Hall, I wrote, you might say, a kind of restatement, a redeclaration of our independence as the people independent from tyrannical government. And I called it a remonstrance of the people of the United States of America. And I start by drawing on those very statements that you've just heard me read that opened the Declaration of Independence, which I read at the top of the show. See if this resonates with you. Whereas our rights enumerated in our Constitution have been won with blood against tyrants for 1,000 years, whereas that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whereas whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Whereas when a long train of abuses and usurpations evinces a design to reduce those rights, it is the duty of the people to throw off such government. Whereas under the Patriot Act and other legislation, even free speech has been criminalized and security of personal property is denied. Whereas under the National Defense Authorization Act and other legislation, the privacy of the people is violated daily. Whereas under the aforesaid legislation, the basic rights of due process and habeas corpus have been abrogated, even to the extent that the government asserts an unnatural privilege to kill American citizens. Whereas our police have been turned into a domestic paramilitary force directed against those who pay them and whom they serve. Whereas our sons and daughters have been sent to die in wars not fought to protect our nation from immediate threats, all in the name of the people, but often without our consent or even the consent of those who represent us. Whereas the people are criminalized by a tax code so complex that no one can possibly comply with complete accuracy and are therefore liable to punishment. Whereas millions of fellow Americans languish in prison cells for so-called crimes that did no harm to anyone in either person or property. Whereas our political system has been corrupted by a political duopoly of Republican and Democratic parties that has legislated to deny fair access to the political process by those who do not promote the agendas of either of those two parties. Whereas those same parties empower themselves at the expense of the people by gerrymandering to ensure that most elections are foregone conclusions without any possibility of unseating the incumbent. Whereas institutions of the federal government, such as the central bank, transfer the wealth of the people to selected entities without specific authorization by the people or their representatives. Whereas unelected executive agents make rules with the force of law without the approval of the people or their representatives. Whereas it has become the habit of our presidents to collapse the necessary divide between the legislature and the executive by using executive orders not in support of legitimate executive duties, but by directing the aforesaid executive agencies to enforce against the people rules that have not been established in law. Whereas our politicians accept money from entities that, not being people, have no democratic standing and create legislation in the interest of those entities despite harm done to the people. Whereas our entire political system has become a means of imposing the worldview of some of the people on others using the force of government, rather than a means of protecting our life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is the government's only function and justification. Whereas the final protection of our liberties, the right of jury nullification by which a jury may judge not only a defendant, but also unjust legislation by which he is convicted, is hidden from the people. Whereas each representative has sworn an oath to uphold the Constitution and not the narrow interests of any organization, political, economic, or cultural. Whereas almost all representatives are in violation of their oath and therefore wield delegated power without legitimacy. Therefore, we, the people in whom all power resides, revoke that delegation of power and demand, consistent with the duty of the people, made explicit in our Declaration of Independence, the following. All laws that seek to limit those rights of the people that are codified in the Bill of Rights shall be repealed. In particular, the Patriot Act, National Defense Authorization Act, sections 1021 and 1022, and the Federal Restricted Buildings and Ground Improvement Act shall be repealed. Where it is necessary for covert operations to be conducted in defense of our nation, those operations shall be governed according to principles that are publicly known and set in law. And those servants of the people who are tasked with covert operations shall be individually criminally liable for failing to act according to said principles. A body with the sole mandate of protecting the natural rights of the people shall be established with access to all information held by government agencies about people on whom no warrant has been served and who have not been charged with a crime. That body shall have the power to investigate the procedures used by our covert agents and shall be given authority to publicize their findings and initiate terminations when violations are found. The federal government shall not require from state or local law enforcement agencies shared jurisdiction for any reasons whatsoever, including but not limited to the receiving of resources such as military equipment and manpower. No government agent shall threaten lethal force against any U.S. citizen except in response to an imminent threat of the unlawful use of force against human life. No American shall be held criminally responsible for any tax that cannot be calculated by an individual with a typical high school education. The individual tax return shall not exceed 1 page in length. Income tax shall not be garnered from salaries paid by employers, except with the consent of the payer or when the payer has been found guilty of tax evasion. No American shall have to divulge the whereabouts of any of his assets within or outside the country unless he has been found criminally guilty of tax evasion or other property crime. All contrary legislation shall be repealed or amended. No action without an identifiable victim shall be a federal crime. Accordingly, no American shall be incarcerated for actions that do not violate the natural rights of another. All contrary legislation shall be repealed. To debates held between candidates or their representatives for public consumption shall be invited all candidates of any or no party who are on the ballot and have the theoretical, rather than the statistical, possibility of winning the election in relation to which the debate is being held. No person who has been voted to political office with the official or financial support of any party shall be allowed to directly participate in redistricting. Redistricting shall be conducted by a politically independent body in each state, according to a method that shall be published and opened for public consultation. No information about historical voting patterns may be used in the process of redistricting. Redistricting with the purpose of giving a political party an electoral advantage shall be a criminal offence. The country's central bank shall be audited. All transactions shall be publicized within 1 year of their being made. The constitutional authority of Congress to make legislation shall not be given in any form to any agency under executive control. Should any such agency seek to impose a rule that shall in any way limit the actions of any of the people, they must submit that rule to Congress for a vote. It shall become enforceable only when it is law. The President shall sign no executive order for a purpose other than enabling him to conduct the affairs of his office. He shall claim no authority to abrogate or change any legislation passed by the people's representatives. All powers and authorities possessed by the President, any other officer or employee of the federal government, or any executive agency as a result of any declaration of national emergency, of which more than 30 are currently in effect, shall be terminated within 90 days, unless each House of Congress shall meet to vote on a joint resolution to renew that emergency. All future national emergencies will automatically terminate within 90 days without congressional joint resolution and will not be eligible for renewal by the President without said resolution. The legally required condition for such emergencies that there be, quote, unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, unquote, will be applied with its intended strict definition. Any pro forma application of these words will nullify the national emergency created. Only American citizens can vote. Organizations, including but not limited to corporations, charities, and unions, are not citizens and cannot vote. Only citizens who may vote for a candidate or ballot initiative may contribute material resources to that candidate or initiative, his or her campaign, or any political organizations that seek to affect the outcome of an election involving that candidate or a vote concerning the initiative. All legislation passed by Congress shall specify that part of the Constitution that authorizes the legislation. The commerce, general welfare, necessary and proper, and tax and spending clauses shall be applied only in their original meanings. Juries in federal criminal cases shall be informed of their right to nullify the law under which the defendant is being tried. That is to say that a jury will be informed of its duty to find a defendant not guilty if the legislation under which he would otherwise be convicted is contrary to natural justice and common law. There shall be no garnishment of assets by any federal authority or agency from anyone who has not been found guilty of a crime. Fraud is a deception deliberately practiced in order to secure unfair or unlawful gain. Accordingly, federal representatives shall be personally and criminally liable for failing to honor their oaths of office. To which end, we the people declare that those in office who purport to represent us no longer do, and shall not be deemed to do so until they consent to the demands herein, and express their sincere intention to use their political office to fulfill these demands. Until then, we leave our political servants with the words of a former president as they consider the weight of their responsibility in the precarious position of our nation. Quote, those who make peaceful revolution impossible make violent revolution inevitable. John F. Kennedy. Should those who borrow the power of the people continue to use it against the people's rights, whose protection is the only justification for the delegation of said power, then we the people shall hold them entirely responsible for the consequences. That's what I think we need today. That's our current declaration of we the people, declaring our independence from those tyrants up in DC. Some of those clauses may sound a little strange, Maybe if you don't know to the extent to which national emergencies are being used to justify arbitrary rule, then you might want to check that out, for example. If you don't know anything about jury nullification and why that's so fundamental to our preserving the rights that the Declaration of Independence was declared to protect, then you need to go check it out. That thing I have just read, that remonstrance to the people of the United States of America, is something I actually discussed in a recent interview on this show with the constitutional attorney who helped me craft it. Her name is Chris Ann Hall, and you can hopefully find that interview that I did with her in the archives. In any case, we need to do more than declare. We need to be prepared to act just as the founders were. They didn't just make the declaration and then run away, did they? They made the declaration and then they stood up. I would love to be able to take the current declaration, that one I've just read to you all. I would love to be able to take that to DC and make those demands and know that hundreds of thousands of Americans were behind me. And if we're not prepared to do something like that, what are we celebrating on July the 4th? I mean, really, what are we celebrating if we're just prepared to let it slide away? Are we prepared to stand up again? I think we need to be specific in the demands, which that document is, that remonstrance of the people of the United States of America, as I'm calling it, is. It's specific. But it also firmly roots them in the instructions in the Declaration of the Independence, which I opened the show with. Instructions that, to we the people, to alter or abolish a form of government that no longer protects life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's why it seemed appropriate to me to read this today. You will have recognized, as I opened my remonstrance, that I quote as justification for the whole effort lines from the Declaration of Independence. So that's what I'm doing about the Declaration of Independence. What are you doing about American independence? Are you just eating burgers? Or are you prepared to actually stand up? If you like the way I've done it, if you want to throw your weight behind that set of demands and that set of grievances, which are at least as important as the demands, then go to magnacarta.us, magnacarta.us. You can read that document there, by the way. And just give us your email address. Just give us your email address, please. If I can get thousands of names, I will fly to DC and I will present this document as a list of demands. Just demands for what, the founders were demanding with that declaration and later with the Constitution. As I described in the second segment, the founders were part of a culture that were reacting against political overreach as they feared that rights they already believed they had were being taken away. That is always the trigger for increased liberty, as it was the trigger for the foundation of our nation, which increased our liberty. We're there again. We're there again. When do we say enough is enough? On July the 4th, 1776, our ancestors said, enough is enough. So, this is the Enough is Enough Blue Republican radio show in celebration of the independence of our great nation. And it's weird because here I am trying to become an American and I'm from the native land from which we all won our independence. And I feel that this is my project too. I feel that America is kind of the best of British. The British have lost the best of British, and whatever that was is here now. So I had to move my whole life out here to fight for the tradition that I grew up in and that I want to contribute to. Happy Independence Day, everybody. Since we're talking American independence, I would just like to leave you all with this final thought. The executive order and the signing statement, which we hear so much about these days, were actually illegal and not used even 100 years before the founding of America, and today we see loads of them every day by our president. America's 21st century presidency concentrates more power in one man than existed in the hands of the monarch of the very country against whom we supposedly rebelled for liberty in the 18th century. And what's even more shocking is in the old motherland, which retains its actual monarchy and is run politically by a prime minister, the former has no power, the monarch has no power to act politically, and the prime minister has no power to act unilaterally. So indeed, if 1776 is our starting point as a nation, the political settlement of the tyrannical motherland has perhaps continued broadly in the direction of individual liberty, while that of the liberty-loving rebels, us, has slid back an entire century to some pre-1688 concentration of power in which the king, I mean president, can make law through executive order. Without doubt, at the birth of our nation, Americans fought less of a monarchy than we now tolerate. And more shamefully for us, even those English against whom we supposedly fought for higher ideals of liberty had shed more blood over the centuries before that point to rid themselves of a less monarchical government than now exists in our country today. Surely, if we let stand what stands in America today, we give the lie to our supposed national identity and bluster like a boorish adolescent who believes he's owed credit for the massive inheritance his father left him, despite the fact he's blown the lot. That's what we're doing. We're blowing our inheritance of liberty. At the time of the writing of the Constitution, William V, Prince of Orange, watched with deep engagement the birth of the USA thousands of miles away, and in a letter to John Adams wrote, "Sir, you have given yourselves a king under the title of the President." My small contribution to liberty in the United States is to train and consult to liberty activists that understand all of this and want to take us back to our founding ideals. If you're interested in perhaps supporting my efforts, please go to bluerepublican.org. And just let me know who you are. Just stick your email in the box there to express interest. Find out a little bit about what I'm doing through Blue Republican, which is my vehicle for activism for liberty. And whatever yours may be, I hope it's successful.
Revolutionary talk for revolutionary times. Promoting peace, liberty, and prosperity around the clock. LibertyTalk.fm.